A black woman arrested. A corrupt cop. A system built to break her. Monique Harlow was on her way home until red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. A routine stop? No, a trap. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't a threat. But to them, she looked like she didn't belong. And that was enough. What started as an unlawful arrest will become the biggest mistake of their lives. Because Monique isn't just another black woman thrown into the system. She's the one who prosecutes corrupt cops like them. But power doesn't surrender easily. As the lies pile up and the system closes in, Monique will have to fight, not just for herself, but for every person who's been silenced before her. By the time this battle is over, badges will fall, careers will end, and justice will be served like never before. So now, the real question isn't whether she'll win. It's how many of them she'll take down along the way. What would you do in her place? And where in the world you are watching? Like, comment below, and subscribe. Game on. What if justice was never meant for you? What if, no matter how hard you fought, no matter how much you abided by the law, it was still designed to crush you? Monique Harlow had spent years believing in the system, playing by its rules, and wielding its power. But in a single night, everything she thought she knew would shatter. The city at night had a pulse, steady, unbroken. Streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, neon signs hummed, and car horns blared from blocks away. The distant sound of sirens was nothing unusual. Downtown thrived in the chaos of nightlife, but Monique was far from the clubs and bars. She was in a neighborhood where silence reigned, where luxury condos stood like sentinels, their tinted windows shielding their wealthy occupants from the realities of the world below. The time on the dashboard read 11:42 p.m., later than she planned, but still early enough that the streets weren't completely deserted. Monique adjusted the mirror and exhaled, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. It had been a grueling day, one of those cases where the prosecution dragged their feet, stalling at every opportunity. She had won today's battle, but the war was far from over. Home. That's all she wanted. A hot shower, a glass of wine, and silence. Then came the lights. Red and blue flooded her rearview mirror, the siren a sharp command that made her stomach tighten. Her fingers tensed on the steering wheel. Stay calm. Follow protocol. She pulled over, placed both hands on the wheel, and waited. The protocol had been drilled into her from childhood. No sudden movements. Stay polite. Stay alive. A heavy-set man stepped out of the police cruiser, his uniform crisp, the glint of a badge reflecting the streetlights. Vaughn Mercer. Her blood ran cold. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Mercer had a reputation, a bad one. Rumors whispered through the courthouse of cases built on coerced confessions, of complaints that never stuck, of power abused in the shadows. She had never encountered him personally, but she knew enough to recognize a dangerous man when she saw one. Another officer, Elliot Grayson, lingered by the passenger door, younger, uncertain. He didn't move with the same air of confidence as Mercer. He was watching, waiting. Mercer strolled up to her window, eyes scanning her car, her face, the briefcase on the seat beside her. License and registration. Monique's voice remained steady. Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over? A slow smirk spread across Mercer's face. You were driving slow. Thought I'd check in. She felt her jaw tighten. A flimsy excuse. I was obeying the speed limit. Mercer ignored her, glancing at Grayson before turning back to her. Nice car. Expensive. You from around here? She knew where this was going. I'm heading home from work. Mercer let the silence hang for a moment, then glanced at her tailored blazer, the designer briefcase, the sleek car that, to him, seemed out of place with the woman behind the wheel. What do you think, Grayson? Mercer asked, tilting his head slightly toward the younger officer. She look like she belongs here? Grayson hesitated. His grip on the flashlight tightened, and for a second, Monique thought he might speak up. But then, he just looked away. She fought to keep her voice even. Officer Mercer, unless you have probable cause, I am not required to exit my vehicle. Mercer's smirk faded. His fingers rested on the edge of his holster. Step out, Ms. Harlow. She stayed still. Am I under arrest? Now you are. The door yanked open, and before she could react, Mercer's grip was on her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back with unnecessary force. The cold bite of metal clamped around her wrists. Wait. Grayson's voice finally broke through, but Mercer ignored him, shoving Monique against the hood of her car. She clenched her teeth as Mercer tightened the cuffs more than necessary. Pain flared up her arms, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Her briefcase had fallen to the pavement, papers spilling out. A case she had spent months preparing, now scattered and trampled. "This is unlawful," she hissed, her voice sharp with restrained fury. "You're making a mistake." Mercer leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "Mistake," he murmured. "The only mistake here is thinking the law protects you." He yanked her upright, his grip bruising as he shoved her toward the squad car. The night air was thick with silence. Even the city seemed to be holding its breath. As he pushed her into the back seat, she locked eyes with Grayson. His hands were balled into fists, his jaw tight. He knew this was wrong. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Not here. Not now. This wasn't over. The station smelled of cheap coffee, old paper, and something stale, like sweat soaked into concrete. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to give the place a sickly, unstable glow. Monique Harlow was marched through the precinct with Von Mercer's iron grip on her arm. She had been in police stations before, but never on this side of the desk. She had walked these halls with purpose, demanding justice for her clients, forcing the law to acknowledge those it preferred to ignore. But now she was just another suspect. Every step felt like a ritualistic humiliation, as if dragging her in cuffs through the station was part of some unspoken initiation. Officers lifted their heads as she passed, some curious, others indifferent. A few smirked, entertained by the sight of a well-dressed black woman in handcuffs, as if her presence here justified something they had always believed. Mercer stopped at the front desk, his grip on her arm finally loosening. He turned to the booking officer, a thick-set woman with sharp eyes and an expression of permanent boredom. "Got a troublemaker," Mercer announced, his voice carrying an unmistakable smugness. "Didn't cooperate, acting suspicious." Monique stood tall, keeping her expression unreadable. "Walking home from work is now a crime?" The booking officer didn't even look at her. "Name?" Mercer grinned. "Monique Harlow." For a split second, the booking officer hesitated, her pen hovering over the form. She recognized the name. Monique saw it in the flicker of her eyes, the twitch of her jaw. But the hesitation passed quickly. Charges: obstruction, resisting arrest. Mercer leaned on the desk casually, as if none of this really mattered. "And let's throw in trespassing while we're at it." Monique's hands curled into fists behind her back. "Trespassing," she repeated. "I was on a public street." Mercer ignored her. The booking officer filled out the paperwork and gestured for an officer to take Monique's fingerprints. A younger cop, maybe in his mid-20s, hesitated before approaching. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot before finally stepping forward. "Right hand first." Monique complied, watching as her fingers were pressed into ink and then onto the booking sheet. Each press felt like another layer of control being stripped away. Mercer, standing nearby, looked far too pleased with himself. She had all this fancy paperwork, he said to no one in particular. Didn't want to cooperate. Probably one of those activist types. Thinks the law doesn't apply to her. Monique lifted her chin. "The law does apply to me, Officer Mercer. That's why you're going to regret every second of this." The smirk faded from his face for just a moment. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. "Mercer." Officer Elliot Grayson stood near the door, his posture stiff, his hands in his pockets. He had been quiet since the arrest, but now he looked uneasy. "What?" Mercer snapped. Grayson hesitated. His gaze flicked to Monique, then back to Mercer. "Are we sure about this?" Mercer's face darkened. "You got a problem?" Grayson exhaled sharply and shook his head. No. Mercer studied him for a long moment before turning away. "Good." Monique said nothing, but she didn't miss the way Grayson's jaw tightened, how his fists clenched at his sides. Doubt. It was a small thing, but in a place like this, it mattered. The booking officer handed the paperwork to Mercer. Cell 3's open. Mercer grabbed Monique's arm again, this time leading her down the dimly lit corridor toward the holding cells. The air grew heavier with each step, the sounds of distant voices and clanging metal thickening the space around her. He stopped in front of a cell and unlocked the door. Home sweet home. Monique stepped inside without a word. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of resistance. The door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed. She turned, facing Mercer through the bars. "I hope you enjoy this moment, Officer Mercer." He smirked. "Why is that?" "Because soon enough, you're going to wish it never happened." Mercer chuckled, shaking his head as he walked away. "Keep dreaming, lady." The hallway light flickered as he disappeared from view. Monique sat on the cold metal bench, her back straight, her mind racing. She had spent her entire career fighting against men like Mercer. She had seen how power warped people, how it made them believe they were untouchable. She had been underestimated before. It had never ended well for the people who did. The holding cell was cold, not just physically, though the concrete bench beneath Monique Harlow offered no warmth, but in a way that seeped into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. The walls were peeling, the air thick with a faint smell of disinfectant and sweat. The light overhead flickered every few minutes, casting erratic shadows across the room. She sat upright, back straight, refusing to let exhaustion take over. Time stretched in places like this. The absence of a clock made minutes feel like hours, but Monique had trained herself to measure time differently, by the number of steps officers took down the corridor, by the distant hum of conversations from the main office, by the clang of the metal doors when they swung open and shut. She listened, observed, calculated. A pair of boots approached. Mercer. His smirk was already in place when he stopped in front of her cell, arms crossed. "How's our VIP guest holding up?" Monique met his gaze without a hint of fear. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Can you blame me?" He leaned against the bars, fingers tapping lazily against the metal. "It's not every day we get someone like you in here. All dressed up, looking important. And now," he tilted his head, "now you're just another inmate." Monique smiled, slow and deliberate. "You keep telling yourself that, Officer Mercer." His smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he masked it. "Big talk," he said, pushing off the bars. "But let's see how far that gets you." With that, he turned and walked away, his boots echoing down the hallway. Monique exhaled slowly, her mind working through the steps she needed to take next. She wasn't just going to sit here and wait, because she knew something Mercer didn't. This wasn't over. Hours passed before the next major shift in the air. Monique heard voices, low, tense. Not Mercer's. Grayson. She had noticed the younger officer's hesitation earlier, the way he had stiffened when Mercer pushed too far. And now he was back. He approached her cell with none of Mercer's bravado. His hands were in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Monique stood, stepping forward until only the bars separated them. "Officer Grayson," she said smoothly. "Come to check on me?" He didn't smile. "You're a lawyer." Monique arched a brow. "Good deduction. You know this arrest was bullshit." Her smile faded. "So do you." Grayson shifted, glancing over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "Mercer, he's been running this place like it's his personal kingdom. He gets away with things because no one questions him. But this..." He shook his head. "This feels different." Monique studied him carefully. "And what are you going to do about it?" Grayson hesitated. Then the sound of boots echoed down the hall. "Mercer." Grayson stiffened, stepping back just as Mercer appeared, his smirk firmly in place. "Something wrong, Grayson?" Mercer's tone was mocking, but there was an underlying edge of warning. Grayson shook his head. "Just making sure the prisoner isn't causing trouble." Mercer chuckled. "Oh, don't worry. She's exactly where she belongs." He shot Monique one last smug glance before motioning for Grayson to follow him. The younger officer hesitated, then obeyed. Monique watched them go, her mind already spinning through the implications of their conversation. Doubt. It had been planted, and doubt was the first crack in any system. Sometime later, Monique was led out of the holding cell and into a small, windowless room. A single metal chair sat opposite a desk, behind which was a man she recognized immediately. Carter Whitaker, the district attorney's office's attack dog. A man who built his career by ensuring cases like this never saw the light of day. Monique took a seat, smoothing her hands over her thighs. Whitaker didn't bother with pleasantries. You're facing obstruction, resisting arrest, and trespassing charges. Monique folded her arms. Trespassing? I was walking on a public street. Whitaker ignored her. The prosecution is willing to offer a deal. She leaned back. Let me guess. Plead guilty, pay a fine, and get on with my life. He smirked. A suspended sentence, minimal consequences. Take the deal, and this all goes away. Monique stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. No. Whitaker's smirk twitched. Think carefully, Ms. Harlow. This could get messy for you. She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. You think I don't know how this works? You're trying to scare me into submission. But here's the thing, Mr. Whitaker, she smiled. I don't scare easily. His jaw tightened. This isn't over, he said finally. Monique's smile didn't waver. No, it's not. Monique Harlow knew how cases like this played out. She had seen them unfold time and time again. Manufactured charges, a stacked deck, and a system designed to break people before they could fight back. But Mercer had made a mistake. He thought she was just another victim, just another name on a report that no one would ever question. He was wrong. She just had to play the long game. The cell door clanged open, and an officer motioned for her to stand. You're up. Monique smoothed her blazer, a small act of defiance in the face of their attempt to reduce her to nothing, and stepped forward. Mercer was waiting for her just outside the holding area, leaning against the wall with the same arrogant smirk. Hope you're ready for your big debut. Monique didn't respond. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He led her down the narrow corridor toward the courtroom. It wasn't a real trial. Not yet. Just a preliminary hearing meant to rubber stamp the charges against her. But she knew that every moment counted. Because if there was one thing she had learned from years of practicing law, it wasn't about the truth. It was about what you could prove. The courtroom was small but packed. Officers loitered along the back wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. A few reporters sat near the front, notepad in hand, waiting for something interesting to happen. But most of the crowd was here for a show, and Mercer knew it. He strutted inside like he owned the place, taking a seat near the prosecution's table with a smug grin. Monique kept her chin high as she was led to the defense table, the cold metal of her handcuffs digging into her wrists. Then the judge entered. Sebastian Lowell, a man who had spent his career protecting the very system Monique was now trapped in. Lowell settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he skimmed the file before him. Let's make this quick. The prosecutor, Carter Whitaker, stood. Your Honor, the state is prepared to present evidence that Ms. Harlow was engaged in suspicious activity, failed to comply with a lawful order, and obstructed an officer's duty. Monique let out a slow breath. Here it comes. Whitaker turned toward the jury box, which, at this stage, was empty. A formality. We have surveillance footage that clearly shows Ms. Harlow resisting arrest. A screen lit up. A grainy black and white video played. It showed Monique standing beside her car, speaking with Mercer. The audio was conveniently muted. Then Mercer reached for her, and Monique stepped back. The footage cut abruptly, skipping over the part where Mercer had grabbed her without cause, twisting her arm and throwing her against the car. Instead, the next frame showed her struggling, as if she had initiated the altercation. It was doctored, manipulated, and she had no way to prove it. Yet, Lowell nodded. Seems clear to me. Does the defense have any objections? Monique turned to her lawyer, Lance Holloway, who had been assigned to her case at the last minute. He was competent, but she could already see the defeat in his eyes. Your Honor, Lance said carefully, the video has been edited. We request access to the full footage. Whitaker smirked. The footage is what it is. Lowell barely looked up. Request denied. Monique clenched her fists under the table. This was a farce. She was watching a machine operate exactly as it had been designed, to bury people like her before they ever had a chance to fight back. But they weren't going to bury her. A murmur spread through the room as a voice spoke up from the back. I'd like to testify. Monique turned. John Calloway, the store owner, the man who had seen everything. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. Lowell frowned. Mr. Calloway, do you have relevant information? Calloway nodded. I saw the whole thing. That officer, he pointed to Mercer, stopped her for no reason. She didn't do anything wrong. The courtroom tensed. Whitaker was the first to recover. Your Honor, this is an informal hearing. Witness testimony isn't necessary at this stage. Lowell waved a hand. Let's hear him. Calloway stepped forward. I own the shop on the corner where she was stopped. I saw her park, step out of her car, and then Mercer pulled up. She wasn't doing anything but walking. He looked at Monique. Then he grabbed her. Monique held his gaze, silent gratitude passing between them. Whitaker scoffed. A shopkeeper's opinion isn't enough, Lowell interrupted. He turned back to Calloway. Are you suggesting the officer had no reason to stop her? Calloway met his gaze evenly. That's exactly what I'm saying. A beat of silence. Then Mercer laughed. This is ridiculous, he said. You're seriously taking his word over an officer of the law. Lowell considered this. Then he sighed. The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges, he said briskly. Ms. Harlow will remain in custody until trial. Monique's stomach dropped. That was it. Calloway had done what he could, but the machine kept turning. She was still trapped, and Mercer knew it. He leaned back in his chair, triumphant. As Monique was led from a courtroom, she caught Grayson's eye. He was watching. Something was shifting. Doubt. And doubt was dangerous. Monique Harlow sat in the dimly lit holding cell, her mind racing. The air was thick with disinfectant and despair, the same stifling atmosphere she had seen break so many of her clients before. But she wasn't them. She refused to be another victim swallowed whole by the system. Outside, the station buzzed with life. Phones rang, officers chatted, paper shuffled. To them, she was already guilty. The hearing had been a mere formality, a well-rehearsed performance where truth held no value. Calloway had tried to help, but in the end, it hadn't mattered. Lowell had played his role perfectly, and now she was trapped. A door opened. Monique lifted her head as Mercer strutted in, smirking. Still holding up, counselor? She said nothing. He chuckled. I gotta say, I almost feel bad. But then again, you brought this on yourself. Monique's fingers curled into fists. By existing? By thinking you're untouchable, he corrected. You should have taken a deal. You think you're different, but you're just another loudmouth who doesn't know when to shut up. Monique forced a smile. I know exactly when to shut up, Mercer. Just not when a fool like you tells me to. His smirk twitched. You think you scare me? He leaned closer, voice low. You don't. You're done. No one's coming to save you. Monique held his gaze. You sure about that? Mercer's eyes flickered, just for a second. Then he scoffed. You'll see soon enough. He knocked on the bars, signaling the guard. Enjoy your stay. As he disappeared down the hall, Monique exhaled, her mind already moving to the next step. She needed an ally, and she had an idea who it might be. Hours passed before she heard the footsteps she was waiting for. Elliot Grayson. He hesitated outside her cell, arms crossed, eyes scanning the hallway before finally stepping closer. You were right, he muttered. Monique tilted her head. About what? Mercer. The whole damn system. He exhaled sharply. I looked you up. Your record, your cases. You're not just some random lawyer. You put guys like Mercer away. Monique studied him. And now you're wondering if you're one of them. Grayson flinched. She stood, stepping to the bars. You know this arrest was wrong. You knew it when Mercer pulled me over. His jaw tightened. She softened her tone. Why are you really here? Grayson hesitated, then pulled something. From his pocket, a leather case. Monique's breath caught. Her badge. Mercer had taken it the night of her arrest. Grayson slid it between the bars. I found it in the evidence locker. It should have been logged. It wasn't. Monique took it, fingers brushing over the engraved letters. Monique Harlow, federal prosecutor. She looked up at him. Why are you giving me this? Grayson exhaled. Because if Mercer's willing to hide this, what else is he hiding? Monique saw it then, the crack in his armor, the doubt that had been growing since the moment Mercer put her in cuffs. You want to do the right thing, she said. Grayson ran a hand through his hair. I don't even know what that is anymore. You do, Monique said. You just don't like the answer. He didn't argue. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. I'll be back. Then he was gone. Monique held the badge tightly. The tide was turning. In the squad room, Mercer was leaning back in his chair, feet kicked up on the desk. Across from him, Carter Whitaker scrolled through his phone, barely paying attention. They'll push for a formal trial, Whitaker said. Not that. It matters. Mercer smirked. Let them try. Whitaker glanced up. You're not worried? About what? Mercer scoffed. A couple of reporters sniffing around? Please. He sat forward. Harlow's finished. She's got no leverage. Whitaker frowned. Unless she finds some. Mercer waved him off. And where's she gonna get it? She's locked up. As if on cue, a younger officer rushed in, looking uneasy. Sir, Internal Affairs just called. Mercer's smirk faded. What? They're requesting a meeting. About the Harlow case. Whitaker sat up. That was fast. The officer hesitated. And there's more. A reporter from the Tribune filed a public records request. They want footage of the arrest. Mercer's expression darkened. Then the officer dropped the final blow. And Officer Grayson just accessed the evidence room. Mercer went still. Slowly he stood, his usual arrogance shifting into something colder. Grayson. He should have known. Back in her cell, Monique sat with her badge in her lap, her mind already mapping out the next move. Mercer thought he had won, but she had just been dealt her first real card, and she was about to play it. Monique Harlow sat on the cold metal bench of her cell, her fingers tracing the edges of her recovered badge. It was more than just an object, it was proof. Proof that Mercer had something to hide. Proof that Grayson had doubt. Proof that the system wasn't as airtight as they wanted it to be. She had been in this cell for too long. It was time to act. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. She tucked the badge into her blazer just as the door swung open. 2 officers stood there, but it wasn't just any officers. It was Mercer and Whitaker. Mercer's usual smugness was gone. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid. Whitaker, on the other hand, looked as composed as ever, but Monique could see the tension in his eyes. We need to talk, Mercer said, voice tight. Monique leaned back against the wall. By all means. Mercer motioned to the guards. Leave us. They hesitated, exchanging glances. Mercer's voice sharpened. Now, as the door shut behind them, Whitaker stepped forward. Let's cut the bullshit, Harlow. You're making things difficult. Monique gave him a slow smile. You're going to have to be more specific. Mercer exhaled sharply. Internal Affairs is sniffing around. The Tribune's digging into the case. And now, his eyes narrowed, one of my own men is asking the wrong questions. Monique tilted her head. Which one? You know damn well which one, Whitaker said. Grayson. Her silence was enough of an answer. Whitaker sighed. Look, you have no case. Even if IA gets involved, they won't move fast enough to help you. You can't win this. Monique smirked. Then why are you here? Whitaker's composure cracked just slightly. Mercer stepped in. We're giving you one last chance. Take the deal. Plead guilty to obstruction. You walk out of here by the end of the week. Monique chuckled, shaking her head. You still think I'm scared? Mercer's fists clenched. If you fight this, we will bury you. Monique stood slowly, stepping toward them until she was just inches away from Mercer. You already tried, she said. And I'm still here. Silence stretched between them. Then Whitaker sighed. Fine, let her rot. He turned to leave, but Mercer lingered for a second longer. His eyes were colder than before. You have no idea what you're up against, Harlow. She didn't blink. Neither do you. Mercer's jaw tightened. Before he stormed out of the cell, Monique exhaled. That was the last offer they'd give her, which meant they were getting desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Meanwhile, in the squad room, Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the open case file in front of him. The evidence against Monique had never sat right with him. But now, after everything he had seen, Mercer hiding her badge, IA suddenly getting involved, it was clear. This was a setup. He glanced around before quickly pulling up the station's internal records. If Mercer was willing to hide Monique's badge, what else had he hidden? His fingers flew over the keyboard, searching through old arrest reports, complaints, anything that looked off. Then he found it. A pattern. Dozens of cases where Mercer had arrested black defendants under suspicious circumstances. Reports missing body cam footage. Complaints were dismissed before they reached IA. Grayson's stomach twisted. He had known Mercer played fast and loose with the law, but this was systematic. A shadow fell over his desk. He looked up. Mercer. Grayson's throat went dry. Mercer stared at the open file, then at Grayson. You're in over your head, Mercer said quietly. Grayson shut the file. I'm just doing my job. Mercer's expression darkened. Not anymore, you're not. A beat of silence. Then Mercer leaned in. Walk away. Now. Before this becomes your problem. Grayson clenched his jaw. And if I don't? Mercer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then it won't just be Harlow's career we bury. Grayson felt the weight of the threat settles over him. Mercer patted his shoulder before walking away. Grayson stared after him. He had a choice to make, and he knew there was only one right answer. Back in her cell, Monique sat in silence. She had expected them to come at her, expected them to threaten her. But what she hadn't expected was the shift happening around her. Grayson was close to tipping over the edge. Mercer was losing control. And now the press was involved. She just needed one final push. Her fingers tightened around her badge. It was time to make her move. Monique Harlow sat in her holding cell, her back straight, her fingers tapping an idle rhythm against the cold metal bench. Every second she remained here, Mercer's grip on the narrative tightened. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She had spent too many years studying the system, pulling apart its weak spots. And now, she was about to exploit them. She needed to get a message out. Her mind worked through the possibilities. The guards? No, too risky. A lawyer? Maybe, but Whitaker would have them monitored. Then she thought of Grayson. He was the only wild card. The one piece Mercer hadn't locked down yet. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. She stood as the door opened. Grayson stepped in, eyes scanning the cell before settling on her. We need to talk, she said before he could speak. He hesitated. That depends on what you have to say. Monique stepped closer, lowering her voice. You know this is a setup. You've seen the evidence. Mercer has been running this game for years, and now you're a part of it. Grayson swallowed. I didn't sign up for this. No, Monique said, holding his gaze. But now you have a choice. You. Either help me take Mercer down, or you let him destroy me, and eventually you. Grayson exhaled sharply, glancing toward the hallway. What do you need? Monique felt the first flicker of real hope since this nightmare began. I need you to get a message to someone outside. Someone I can trust. Grayson hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Who? Monique didn't even pause. Elias Carter. Grayson's eyebrows lifted. The journalist? She nodded. If you get him this message, he'll do the rest. Grayson glanced over his shoulder again before stepping closer. What do I tell him? Monique's voice was steady. Tell him I have proof. Tell him to dig into Mercer's past arrests. Tell him to look for patterns. She met Grayson's gaze. And tell him if he doesn't act fast, they're going to bury me before the truth ever comes out. Grayson studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. I'll see what I can do. Monique exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Mercer sat in his office, fingers drumming against the desk. The walls felt tighter than usual. Everything was moving too fast. Whitaker entered, tossing a file onto his desk. "We have a problem." Mercer's jaw clenched. "What now?" "The Tribune just put in a second request for body cam footage," Whitaker said. "And Internal Affairs is asking questions we can't brush off." Mercer exhaled sharply. "Who the hell is feeding them information?" Whitaker gave him a pointed look. "You already know the answer to that." "Grayson." Mercer shot up from his chair, rage boiling in his chest. "That little shit." Whitaker shrugged. "We need to handle this now." Mercer grabbed his coat. "I'll take care of it." Whitaker frowned. "What does that mean?" Mercer's smirk returned. "It means Grayson needs a reminder of where his loyalty lies." Grayson left the precinct that evening, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The message had been delivered. Carter had listened. Now, all he could do was wait. But he didn't make it far. A black SUV pulled up beside him. The window rolled down. "Mercer." Grayson stiffened. "Going somewhere?" Mercer asked. Grayson forced himself to stay calm. "Home." Mercer smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Get in." Grayson didn't move. Mercer's smile faded. That wasn't a request. Slowly, Grayson slid into the passenger seat. The door locked behind him. They drove in silence for several blocks before Mercer finally spoke. "You've been busy." Grayson kept his expression neutral. "Just doing my job." Mercer scoffed. "Let's drop the act. You think you're some kind of hero? You think helping Harlow makes you better than the rest of us?" Grayson didn't answer. Mercer's fingers tightened on the wheel. "I've kept this department clean for years. Kept the wrong people out. Kept the street safe. And now, because of you, IA is breathing down my neck." Grayson turned to him. "You mean you kept yourself untouchable?" Mercer's jaw twitched. Then, without warning, he swerved the car into an empty parking lot, slamming it into the park. "Let me make this real simple, Grayson," Mercer said, his voice dangerously low. "Walk away. Right now. Drop this, and you'll keep your job. Hell, you might even get a promotion." Grayson exhaled through his nose. "And if I don't?" Mercer leaned in. "Then you'll go down with her." Silence stretched between them. Then Grayson opened the door. "I'll see you at work." Mercer didn't stop him. He didn't have to. The message was clear. But so was Grayson's answer. Back in her cell, Monique leaned against the cold wall, eyes closed. A guard had slipped her a piece of paper earlier. One simple line scrawled across it. "Message delivered." She smiled. The rigged game was about to break. Monique Harlow sat at the edge of her metal bench, her fingers wrapped around the thin slip of paper Grayson had passed her hours ago. The message was simple but powerful. "It's happening." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. After days of fighting, after endless humiliation, the tide was turning. Elias Carter had everything he needed. The story was out, and Mercer was running out of time. Across town, inside the offices of the Tribune, Elias Carter read over his article one last time before hitting publish. The headline burned across the screen. "Exposing a Lie: How a Routine Traffic Stop Became a Criminal Cover-Up." It detailed everything: Monique's wrongful arrest, Mercer's pattern of racial profiling, the missing body cam footage. The story exposed how Mercer had manipulated the justice system for years, arresting black individuals under false pretenses, ensuring they never had a chance to fight back. And now, Monique was the latest, but she wouldn't be his victim. The moment the article went live, Carter's phone exploded with notifications. Calls from attorneys, civil rights groups, and Internal Affairs. It had begun. At the precinct, Mercer sat in his office, scrolling through his phone as his world imploded. Headlines were everywhere. News stations replayed footage of Monique being shoved into the squad car. Experts dissected the legal implications. And IA had just scheduled an emergency meeting with the police chief. His hands tightened around his phone. Then came the final blow. A video. Someone had leaked the full footage of Monique's arrest. The grainy security footage from a nearby storefront told a different story than Mercer's official report. It showed Monique standing calmly, presenting her badge to Mercer. A badge that proved her real identity. It showed Mercer ripping it from her hand before shoving her against the car. The world now knew the truth. Mercer hadn't just arrested Monique. He had known exactly who she was, and he had arrested her anyway. The precinct was in chaos. Officers whispered in clusters, watching Mercer with wary eyes. Some looked entertained. Others looked like they were already distancing themselves from him. Grayson entered the room just as Mercer threw his phone across the desk. "You're the leak," Mercer said coldly. Grayson didn't deny it. "IA is coming. They want you off duty until the investigation is over." Mercer stood, his rage barely contained. "You think this ends me?" He scoffed. "You think IA is going to save her?" Grayson folded his arms. "She doesn't need saving. She's about to destroy you in court." Mercer's fists clenched. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. Back at the holding cell, the guards arrived. "You're being moved," one of them said. Monique stood, keeping her expression neutral. They led her down the hall, through the back exit of the station, away from the press gathered outside. A car was waiting, not a squad car. A black government SUV. The door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. "Ms. Harlow," he greeted. "I'm Agent Cole. I'm with the Department of Justice. We need to talk." Monique held his gaze. She had just become bigger than Mercer. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all the people he had done this to before. She got into the car. It was time to finish this. The courtroom was silent. Not the usual hum of whispered conversations or the quiet rustling of papers. This silence was different. It was the kind that came before a storm. Monique Harlow sat at the defendant's table, but she wasn't just another accused criminal. She was her own defense. She adjusted the microphone, her fingers resting lightly on the polished wood. The weight of the moment settled in, but she didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this. On the other side of the room, Vaughn Mercer sat stiffly at the prosecution's table. His usual arrogance was gone. His jaw was clenched, his fingers tapping an anxious rhythm against his knee. The uniform he once wore like armor now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. The judge entered. "All rise." Everyone stood. Everyone but Monique. Her message was clear. This wasn't their courtroom anymore. This was hers. Carter Whitaker, once confident, now looked uneasy as he rose to present the prosecution's case. "Your Honor, the state contends that Monique Harlow was lawfully arrested for obstruction and resisting." Monique stood. "Objection." The judge barely glanced up. "On what grounds?" Monique met Whitaker's eyes. "On the grounds that this entire case is built on a lie." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge exhaled sharply. "Ms. Harlow." She stepped forward, owning the space around her. "Your Honor, if the prosecution is going to claim this was a lawful arrest, they should be prepared to explain why Officer Mercer concealed my identity." A murmur spread through the room. Whitaker looked at Mercer, then back at Monique. "Ms. Harlow, if you're implying—" "I'm not implying," she cut in. "I'm proving." She turned to the bailiff. "Please distribute Exhibit A." Folders slid across the wooden tables. Inside, the leaked surveillance footage. The video played. It was brutal. The footage showed Mercer stopping Monique, demanding ID. It showed her pulling out her badge, clearly identifying herself. It showed Mercer snatching it away, shoving her against the car, and pretending he never saw it. The courtroom was deathly silent. Monique let the moment hang before speaking. "Tell me, Officer Mercer, how exactly did you not realize who I was?" All eyes turned to Mercer. His jaw tightened. Let me help you," she interrupted. "You didn't forget. You ignored it. Because arresting a random black woman in a nice neighborhood? That's easy. But arresting the chief, federal prosecutor for civil rights violations? That's a little harder to justify, isn't it?" The silence crushed Mercer. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." The judge held up a hand. I disagree. Monique turned back to Mercer. I wonder, officer, if we pull up your past arrests, how many others look exactly like mine? Mercer's face paled. Because that's exactly what Internal Affairs had done. A second document was passed around. Over a dozen names. All black. All were arrested by Mercer under suspiciously similar circumstances. Monique's voice cut through the tension. I'm not the first. I was just the first you couldn't bury. Whitaker scrambled to redirect. Your Honor, even if Officer Mercer's actions were inappropriate, it does not change the fact that Ms. Harlow resisted arrest. Monique laughed. A sharp, knowing sound that sent a ripple through the jury. I'm sorry, you're saying I should have cooperated while an officer was violating my rights? She turned to the jury. Would you? The weight of the question settled over the room. One by one, heads turned toward Mercer. And that's when he knew. It was over. The judge leaned forward. Officer Mercer, do you have anything to say for yourself? Mercer clenched his jaw. I was following protocol. Monique arched a brow. And what protocol is that? Fabricating charges? Hiding evidence? Or just racial profiling? The tension cracked. Mercer stood abruptly. This is bullshit. The judge's gaze turned sharp. Sit down, Officer Mercer. But Mercer wasn't done. You people, the entire courtroom stilled. Monique smiled. I think we've heard enough. The judge nodded. Agreed. 15 minutes later, the verdict came in. All charges against Monique Harlow are dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to their phones. Spectators whispered. And Mercer? He sat frozen, staring at the table in front of him. His world had just collapsed. As the room emptied, Monique stood. Grayson approached, looking exhausted but relieved. It's done. Monique smiled. Not yet. She turned as Internal Affairs officers entered. Vaughn Mercer, one of them, asked. Mercer lifted his head, his face pale. You're under investigation for misconduct, falsifying reports, and abuse of power. Turn in your badge. The words hit him like a bullet. Mercer opened his mouth to argue, to beg, to do something, but the weight of the room crushed him. Slowly, he reached for his badge, unpinned it, set it on the table. He was done. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Vaughn Mercer, sealing his fate. He stood in the center of the room, wrist shackled, his once pristine uniform replaced by a dull gray jumpsuit. The badge that had once granted him unchecked power was gone. The authority he had wielded so cruelly now meant nothing. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom, final and absolute. Vaughn Mercer, you have been found guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Monique Harlow remained still, her expression unreadable. 15 years. Not enough to undo the damage Mercer had done, but enough to ensure he would never hurt anyone again. Mercer's jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked afraid. The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing his arm. Let's go. Mercer resisted for a fraction of a second. Then, realizing he had no more power, he walked. As he passed Monique, his gaze locked onto hers. For a moment, it was just the two of them, the hunter and the hunted. But today, the roles had reversed. He opened his mouth, maybe to curse her, maybe to beg, but she didn't care. She turned away. And just like that, Mercer was gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, cameras flashing, microphones extending. Monique stepped into the sea of voices, but this time, she wasn't the accused. She was the victor. A journalist pushed forward. Ms. Harlow, do you have any words on today's verdict? Monique exhaled slowly, then met the crowd with a calm, unwavering gaze. Justice was served, she said. That's all there is to say. And with that, she walked away. There was no speech, no rallying cry, no promise of a continued fight. Because the battle was over. Months passed. Monique left the city. She turned down every interview, every book deal, every political opportunity that followed. She had spent too long in the trenches, fighting against a system that sought to destroy her. Now, she just wanted peace. She moved to a quiet town by the coast, where the air was clean and the world moved slower. A place where no one knew her name, where she wasn't the woman who took down Von Mercer, where she could simply exist. And for the first time in years, she felt free. One evening, as she sat on her porch, watching the waves roll in, a thought crossed her mind. She had one, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, beaten down, erased. The system had tried to break her, and it had failed. With a small, satisfied smile, she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let the world move on. The end. What do you think? Did Monique get the justice she deserved? Should corrupt cops and officials face even harsher consequences for abusing their power? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. And let me know where you're watching from. If you believe in fighting back against injustice, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more tales where the untouchable finally face the consequences they never saw coming.